Antony Loewenstein, Disaster Capitalism, Making a Killing Out of Catastrophe. Welcome to the fascinating world of Disaster Capitalism, Making a Killing Out of Catastrophe by Antony Loewenstein. This book summary delves into a global phenomenon where privatization, deregulation, and the slashing of social programs take center stage. Brace yourself for a riveting journey through an economy that exploits vulnerabilities and perpetually widens the global wealth gap, examining the role of corporate-owned media, the privatization of war, and the emergence of the artificial economy. This book casts a critical eye on the jaw-dropping financial gains made in the name of calamities. Loewenstein offers crucial insights into how policies benefit elites while robbing others of essential services, serving as a much-needed eye-opener for anyone willing to examine the world anew.
The Rise of Disaster Capitalism. In her book, Naomi Klein examines the concept of disaster capitalism, which involves the privatization and deregulation of public services and natural resources that provide a safety net for vulnerable communities. The wealthiest 1% of the world owns almost half of all assets, while 14% of Americans struggle to afford food. Private providers are given huge windfalls, with the U.S. war on terror costing around $4 trillion, much of it going to private firms. This trend towards privatization intensifies after calamities such as the 9/11 attacks. The rise of ISIS also provides more opportunities for disaster capitalists. Klein argues that while this system has arisen quietly, alternative approaches are possible. The rise of disaster capitalism. Private military companies took advantage of the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan to earn large sums of money. They provided security to journalists, UN employees, and nonprofits. These private sector mercenaries earned $1,000 a day, far more than American, British, Australian, or South African soldiers. Initially, they worked with little regulation, heavily armed themselves, and aroused suspicion from Afghani officials. As a result, the government began to restrict their activities, including barring foreign mercenary firms. In the U.S., the government outsourced logistics and trash pickup to private companies with expertise, changing how the country waged war. The rise of privatization led to a 20-fold increase in private prisons across the nation since the 1990s, and the inmate population grew 31 times larger. The privatization of war. DynCorp's cozy relationship with the government and the inefficacy of privatized warfare. DynCorp, a U.S. security company, saw demand for its services increase drastically after September 11, winning $1 billion in contracts to assist the Afghan security forces. Despite repeated accusations of overcharging and other dubious business practices, DynCorp continued to enjoy its close relationship with big government in the age of outsourcing. DynCorp was not a diversified company. Instead, 96% of its $3 billion in revenue came from the U.S. government. The privatization of warfare resulted in unsatisfactory outcomes and inefficiency. During the first Bush administration, the public relations firm Hill plus Knowlton was hired to rationalize U.S. military action in Kuwait. In the second Bush administration, its staffers took government jobs and assisted in advocating the war on terror. Although Rumsfeld claimed that the private sector was more effective and efficient, both public and private soldiers shared comparable struggles, such as avoiding contact with civilians and living in a military-enforced bubble. After several years of U.S. military presence in Afghanistan, the country was still left with a flourishing drug trade, warlords in power, and recurring suicide bombings and chaos. Private security, disaster capitalism, and neoliberalism in Pakistan. Pakistan's post-9/11 scenario wasn't far from Afghanistan's, with disaster capitalism taking over the economy that heavily relied on foreign investment from multinationals. The Pakistani government's inability to exert control resulted in the deployment of 300,000 private contractors, making it a lucrative arrangement for security companies like G4S. The drug economy in Afghanistan flourished even after Western troops' withdrawal in 2014, while the country's artificial economy would collapse without international aid. Afghanistan received $15.7 billion in foreign aid in 2010, with the economy facing a $7.7 billion shortfall as Western troops withdraw. Disaster capitalism in Haiti. Following the earthquake that devastated Haiti in 2010, American corporations rushed in with reconstruction and disaster relief contracts worth millions of dollars. Despite Haiti's desperate need for foreign investment, corrupt practices and insufficient infrastructure meant that much of the aid was ineffective or even harmful to the country's population. This book details the exploitation of Haiti's tragedy by disaster capitalists and the complicity of the media and Western governments in perpetuating the cycle of poverty and exploitation. In January 2010, a 7.0 magnitude earthquake struck Haiti, leaving over 1 million people homeless and causing an estimated 316,000 deaths. Despite the country's desperate need for aid and reconstruction efforts, American corporations swooped in to take advantage of the disaster. As the U.S. ambassador cynically noted, the gold rush is on. This book exposes the practice of disaster capitalism and its devastating effects on countries like Haiti. Multinational corporations often exploit disaster situations to secure lucrative contracts for reconstruction and relief efforts, knowing that desperate countries will accept almost any offer of help. In Haiti, the disaster capitalists made millions while the country remained mired in poverty and the infrastructure remained woefully inadequate. The media and Western governments colluded in perpetuating the cycle of poverty and exploitation in Haiti by failing to demand transparency in aid spending and allowing corporations to pay poverty-level wages to Haitian workers. As a result, workers at the Caracol Industrial Park, funded by the U.S. government, earned just $4 a day, while contractors siphoned off half of that for transportation and food. This book is a powerful indictment of disaster capitalism and a call to action for better regulation and transparency in aid spending. It exposes the complicity of Western governments and corporations in perpetuating poverty and exploitation in developing countries, and highlights the urgent need for systemic change. Disaster capitalism in Haiti. Foreign contractors reap relief funds meant for Haiti's people. The aftermath of Haiti's 2010 earthquake saw an influx of $13.5 billion in relief funds. However, instead of being used to aid Haitians, much of the money was channeled to foreign contractors. The country's political and economic systems rely heavily on foreign aid, creating an attractive target for disaster capitalists. The situation was made worse by the nation's over-reliance on imports when it would have been cheaper and better for local farmers to provide essential supplies. The scarcity was then exaggerated to receive more aid, with inflated death tolls and claims of child slavery. The devastating effects of mining in Papua New Guinea. Papua New Guinea's struggle with poverty and violence is compounded by the ecological devastation caused by mining companies such as Rio Tinto. Despite contributing to the country's national budget, these companies have left a legacy of polluted lands and low wages. The government's response to labor unrest and strikes has been brutal, leaving many citizens with little choice but to endure the devastating consequences. The high incidence of rape and sexual assault, affecting over 2/3 of women, underscores the dire need for change in Papua New Guinea's economy and society. Private prisons in the U.S. The United States has the highest incarceration rate globally, and private prisons have become big business for companies like GEO Group and CCA. These corporations benefit from having former government officials on their boards and contribute millions to political campaigns. Proponents argue that private prisons offer taxpayers a better deal, but they cherry-pick their prisoners, housing only the healthier and less expensive ones. Private prison operators claim to be nimble alternatives to government bureaucracies, but they depend entirely on government contracts. They warn investors that their bottom lines would suffer if drug laws were relaxed, sentencing guidelines were lighter, or fewer undocumented immigrants were detained. Operating federal detention centers that hold undocumented immigrants for deportation is a growth area for private prison companies. The book suggests that the erosion of democracy occurs because there is minimal public resistance to the selling of valuable assets and outsourcing of vital state services. Profit-oriented U.S. prisons. The private prison industry in the U.S. runs on profit, and conferences and vendors serve to reinforce the interests of the Fortress America complex. The American Correctional Association Conference in 2014 emphasized the threat of terrorist attacks and featured vendors marketing security kits for prisons and e-cigarettes for inmates. Private prison operators hire inmates out to companies for cut-rate wages, and prisoners pay high fees for services like phone calls. Detention centers like Georgia's Stewart Immigrant Detention Center pay slave wages to immigrants for duties like kitchen work. Complaints about food are common, with inmates going on hunger strikes claiming to find maggots in their meals. All in all, the profit-oriented nature of U.S. jails treats prisoners as a means to an end, instead of helping them rehabilitate.
Having journeyed through the intriguing intricacies of disaster capitalism, we now understand the pervasive yet almost invisible undercurrents of an economy thriving on disaster. With shocking examples from Haiti, Papua New Guinea, and the United States, we've explored how privatization and deregulation perpetuate the global wealth gap, usually in the aftermath of calamities. These policies are often disguised as solutions, ensuring private companies and elites capitalize on the vulnerabilities of others. The immense profits made by private military companies reveal heavy shadow cast by these unethical practices on our modern world. As we grapple with understanding the consequences of ever-mushrooming privatization schemes, this book summary has illuminated the need for greater awareness and alternative solutions.